Okay, so in this little lecture, I want to talk about leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and then diseases and disorders a little bit involving red blood cells and also white blood cells. So, yeah, let's go. So, leukocytes, or white blood cells, are the only blood components that are complete cells, like you would have learned about them in biology. So they have a nucleus, they have mitochondria, they have Golgi, all of those things that you remember, maybe, from biology. They, remember, are part of the buffy coat when you spin the blood down, that very, very small fraction. So there's not usually very many in blood, about 5,000 or so per cubic millimeter. Remember, a cubic centimeter is the same as a milliliter, so this is really small. The job of leukocytes generally is to protect us from infectious microorganisms. And so when we talk about the lymphatic and immune systems in the next unit, we'll come back and talk more about kind of the mechanisms of how white blood cells work. Many of them, as you'll see, are phagocytic, which means they can engulf and eat, basically, these infectious microorganisms, and then they present those antigens to the body so that you can fight off whatever it is. Okay, so there are many different types of white blood cells that all kind of do different jobs in the body. So we'll talk about some of them in more detail and some in less. So the first category are the granulocytes. Granulocytes include neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. So those are just different specific types of white blood cells that happen to be granulocytes. And they are all phagocytic, which means they all can eat whatever. Bacteria, yeast, fungus, etc. So they're all phagocytic. So here you can see these are neutrophils in the picture. They are the most numerous of the white blood cell types, and they are bacterial slayers, right? So we come into contact with lots of bacteria, and so it makes sense, hopefully, that we would have a lot of the white blood cells whose job it is to hunt down and destroy bacteria. You don't need to know specifically eosinophils or basophils, the other two kinds of granulocytes. They are both involved in kind of response to parasites, so like ticks, worms, amoeba, things like that. Basophils also release cytokines, which are something that we'll talk about more when we talk about immunity. But cytokines kind of bring the immune response to a particular area. So those other two are important, where you just don't need to know about them specifically now. So neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils were all granulocytes. So they have a granular appearance under a microscope. Now we're going to talk about the two different types of agranulocytes. So these are white blood cells that don't have a granular appearance. Such good naming. So the first of the agranulocytes, probably you've heard of, those are lymphocytes. So there are two types of lymphocytes that, again, we'll talk more about when we talk about the immune system. But they are T cells and B cells. T cells are what actually attack foreign or infected cells directly. So, if a cell has been infected by a virus, it's the T cells that are going to come ultimately and destroy it. B cells, which are another type of lymphocyte, are the cells that make antibodies. So they produce the little flags that stick on the outside of infected cells and tell the T cells to destroy them. So again, we'll talk more about these in specifics when we do the immune system. But for now, you just need to know that there are T and B lymphocytes. T cells attack. So T and attack. Sure. And then B cells produce antibodies. So B and body. The other type of agranulocyte is the monocyte. And you probably know monocytes from their other name, which are macrophages. So monocytes are the biggest leukocyte. Just like physically, they're the largest. They stain purple as the other leukocytes do, but they have a fairly specific shaped nucleus. They're kind of U-shaped, so that's how you recognize a monocyte. And what they do is they leave the bloodstream and enter into tissue, and there they become macrophages that you're probably familiar with. So they go in tissue, and they can kind of gobble up invaders and then present them to the rest of the immune system so your body can fight off an attack of disease. So those are all the white blood cells that you need to know. So now, real quick, we're going to talk about platelets, and then we'll talk about the clotting cascade. So platelets are little fragments of cells. Remember, white blood cells are the only true cell in blood. And platelets are, here you can see the fragments. Platelets are function as part of the clotting mechanism, the clotting cascade. So that's what we're going to talk about next, kind of what happens in a coagulation event. Just to warn you, the next slide has kind of a gross picture. It's just like a blood clot picture, but if you think blood clots are gross, then it's gross. Okay, I covered it up to start with because I didn't want you to be distracted. So blood clotting is a really complicated biochemical process. There are many steps that occur with many proteins and other chemicals released to help kind of the clotting process take place. I will post a little video that kind of talks about some of the different more specific steps if you're interested in that. But basically, broadly, there are 3 steps. So injury, step 1. So here you can see there is a hole. So the injury has occurred. Then step 1 of clotting are vascular spasms. So the blood vessel itself contracts to help sort of staunch the bleeding. So you can see there's much less blood there than there. When that opening, that blood vessel opening, is more narrow, that allows for platelets to start to build up and form what's called the platelet plug. So that's going to initially stop the bleeding by just kind of literally plugging the hole. And then the last step is all of that coagulation eventing that I mentioned. So basically, you get all of these protein fibers that help to kind of weave everything together to form the actual clot itself. So like I said, this part in particular is very complex, but it's clot formation. Okay, so I'm going to move the little rectangle so you can see the blood clot picture if you would like to. If you would not like to, then just zip ahead a tiny bit. Okay, so here you can see some serious blood clotting there. Lots of coagulation. Okay, so this is step 3. So we've had vascular spasms, platelet plug has been formed, and now the coagulation events are taking place. So again, this is such a super simplification, but normally blood clotting takes between 3 and 6 minutes, depending upon the severity of the injury. It requires, as I said, a lot of different chemicals to help it actually happen, including calcium, vitamin K, and lots of other things. There are lots of hormones that are involved that help draw what needs to be there. You may have heard about hemophilia. You might have learned about it in either biology or history, because Queen Victoria's family, because they were fairly closely related, passed on hemophilia to several of the family members, most notably one of Tsar Nicholas's sons. So it is it's really a group of coagulation disorders. So there are different causes of hemophilia based on sort of what part of the clotting cascade is interrupted or is affected. But basically it sort of prevents a part of this coagulation process from occurring. And so the clot formation doesn't occur or occurs sometimes very slowly. So that's how blood clots form. That's also why, going back to step 2, the platelet plug formation. That's also why, like, putting pressure on a wound, if you can be really helpful, because it helps kind of keep everything there so that the platelets can build up and form that platelet plug. So, anyway. Okay, now we are going to talk about a few more disorders. And so you're going to watch, after this lecture, you're going to watch some episodes of a YouTube show called Blood Detectives, which goes through some different disorders, some of red blood cells, some of white blood cells. They do a really nice job of presenting kind of in a clinical setting, like what people have to deal with different blood disorders. So I'm just going to talk about a few of them, but know that you'll hear more about particular blood disorders in the next phase of the lesson, and then later on in the unit as well. So erythrocyte disorders affect of course, red blood cells. Erythrocytes are red blood cells. So the first is polycythemia. So poly is like many, right? So polycythemia is an abnormal excess of erythrocytes. So if you think there's way too many red blood cells in the blood, kind of think about what that would do. It would increase the viscosity because there's more stuff in the blood. And it also decreases the flow rate of blood. It sort of clumps very quickly. And kind of as the body, if the body's able to get rid of these excess erythrocytes, that then produces a lot of bilirubin, which, if you remember, is one of the products of the breakdown of red blood cells. So it can kind of create additional problems because bilirubin is what causes jaundice. So that's polycythemia. Next is anemia. Anemia is likely something you've heard of. And it means that blood has an abnormally low oxygen carrying capacity. So anemia itself is a symptom of something occurring that's affecting red blood cells, right? So because there's not enough oxygen carrying capacity, there's not enough hemoglobin, you can't support normal metabolism because you need oxygen to break down sugars, to make ATP, to power your cells. So this can include fatigue, paleness, because you have fewer red blood cells, potentially, shortness of breath, chills, etc. So there are different causes of anemia, but they all sort of stem from insufficient red blood cells, not enough functional red blood cells. So these are just a few sort of causes of anemia. So hemorrhagic anemia is if there was an acute blood loss event or chronic blood loss for some reason, so like internal bleeding or something, can cause hemorrhagic anemia. You're just losing red blood cells too quickly. Hemolytic anemia, so lytic means breaking. Hemo refers to blood, as you know. So this is when red blood cells are prematurely broken down. So we talked about their life cycle and how they, live for about 4 months and then get broken down. But if they get broken down too early and too frequently, that can also cause anemia, hemolytic anemia. Aplastic anemia is when the bone marrow itself, the red bone marrow, isn't making new red blood cells. For maybe the red bone marrow was destroyed for some reason, or it's just not producing red blood cells as it should. And then a fairly common cause of anemia is iron deficiency. So if there's not enough iron in the diet, there's not enough like spinach and leafy greens or meat, red meat in particular contains a lot of iron. If people aren't eating enough of foods that contain iron, then they might not have enough iron to make enough hemoglobin to have enough red blood cells. So here, this is a slide of normal blood. A couple of white blood cells, bunch of red blood cells, happy little donuts. Here you can see the red blood cells are really pale and small. So that is because there's not enough iron to make enough hemoglobin to make full, happy, healthy red blood cells. Another kind of anemia that you've likely heard about is sickle cell anemia. You'll watch one of the Blood Detectives episodes is about sickle cell anemia, and you hopefully remember it from biology as well. And it results from a mutation in a gene that causes hemoglobin, instead of being happy, healthy, clover-shaped hemoglobin, we get what's called hemoglobin S. And so instead of like a clover, clover, it's St. Patrick's Day when I'm doing this, so clover makes sense. So there's normal hemoglobin, like a clover shape. What hemoglobin S does is there's a mutation that causes it to kind of clump together like this, instead of being the little round clover shape. And so because the hemoglobin sticks together like that, in low oxygen situations in particular, it can cause red blood cells to become sickle-shaped, like that. And so instead of being nice, smooth, round red blood cells, some of them sickle, which can be very painful when they try to move through blood vessels. The part that you might remember from biology is that the sickle cell trait, being a heterozygote, can help protect against malaria. And so we'll talk more about that later on in the unit. Okay, couple of white blood cell disorders. Again, just one blood cell disorder. You will watch one of the videos about this as well. Leukemia is any cancer basically involving white blood cells. And what happens with leukemia is that immature white blood cells are found in the bloodstream, so they're not fully developing in the bone marrow as they should. And the bone marrow becomes occupied with cancerous white blood cells. So you're not making those protective cells that the body needs to defend against disease, but instead these non-functional white blood cells. So here you can see this is a normal blood smear, just a few white blood cells. And here, the picture on the bottom, you can see lots and lots and lots of white blood cells, but notice they just look kind of blobby, rather than being like differentiated like the functional ones look like. So that's it. We will, as I said, we'll talk more about sickle cell anemia a little bit later. And now you're going to look at some of these blood disorders and some different ones in the blood detectives part of today's activity. Thanks.